Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. I am Debashis Basu. This fortnight, I'm going to discuss something that has just happened, just about 10 days or so ago. On 4th September, the Reserve Bank of India issued a circular asking banks to link floating rate loans to what is called an external benchmark. Now, what does this mean and what will be the fallout? Beginning 1st October 2019, banks will have to link the interest rates of floating rate loans to one of the specified external benchmarks which the RBI has specified. Now, why has RBI suddenly asked for this? Why now? Why couldn't this have been done earlier? There's a lot of issues involved. Now, the RBI wants to ensure what is called transmission. That's a technical term, but the meaning is very, very simple. Transmission is simply ensuring that when RBI cuts interest rates, banks should immediately cut rates by a similar amount or close to a similar amount. And why is this so important now? Because an important political objective of any government is lower interest rates. Politicians think that lower interest rates will spur economic growth. There'll be more demand for loans, more investments, and growth will increase. Every finance minister demands it at some time or the other. But what was happening is that under the floating rate system, when interest rates go up, banks are very, very quick to increase their rates. But when interest rates drop, they are reluctant to pass on the decline. There is no transmission, or there is very little transmission. It was this that the RBI was trying to fix with its 4th September circular, and that too, of course, under the pressure from New Delhi. My point is, in trying to do this, it may end up creating a different kind of mess. I'll come to that part later, but first, this is really very good news for consumers. And not just because loans will become cheaper. Loans will become cheaper now when interest rates go down further, but it will go up. Loans will become more expensive, EMIs will increase when interest rates go up. So that's not the issue. That's what everybody is talking about. Rates will become cheaper, but rates are already low. So it's more likely that the rates will go up sometime later when there is demand for money and more economic growth, and then the transmission is going to be much faster and you're going to pay a larger price for it. So that's not the point, that the rates will become cheaper. The key thing is, from now on, banks must allow old borrowers to shift to the system. This means putting new and old borrowers on par. This is happening for the first time in 25 years. That's why this is significant for us, that is the consumers, but nobody is talking about it because everybody is talking about the other part of it, which is transmission. For 20 years or 25 years, the RBI has allowed banks to inflict what we see as unfair, opaque, and discriminatory practices on borrowers. Banks know little about the new borrowers, right? They know all about the existing borrowers because these existing borrowers are paying back the money. They know exactly the behavior, what kind of income they have. Banks know all the details. And yet, in a totally unfair practice, banks used to charge the new borrowers less, even when they knew less about them. More risky, charge them less. Existing guys, loyal customers, paying back month after month, they used to charge them more. That discrimination will probably come to an end. Now, banks will have to charge both of them the same rate. Now, nobody is highlighting it. Everybody is focused on transmission. In 1994, this has been going on since 1994, when RBI came up with what is called a prime lending rate. The prime lending rate came in 1994, as I said, and then benchmark PLR in April 2003. So 94 to 2003, this is what was happening, a complete farce. Interest rates are in some place, banks charge something else, new borrowers something else, existing borrowers something else, and so on and so forth. Now, the RBI in 2003, while bringing in this change, they said neither of these two produce adequate monetary transmission, and this defeated the very purpose for which these benchmarks were introduced. This is from an RBI report later. Now, RBI knew. So in 94 they knew, 95 they knew, 2003 they knew, 2006 they knew, and so on and so forth. So RBI has been aware of the fact that there has been no transmission for a very long time. But even when it knew that banks were manipulating unworkable internal benchmarks, what banks used to do is not pass on the rates because they were allowed, the RBI had allowed them to use an internal benchmark, which nobody knew how they calculated. There was no inspections, there was no nothing, no reporting, no compliance on those internal benchmarks. Nobody went and inspected them. So the banks would say, you may have reduced rates, but our costs have gone up, or, we can't reduce rates because of these reasons. And RBI knew it. So in 2016, it came up with one more experiment, which is called marginal cost of funds, which is MCLR, marginal cost of funds lending rate. The idea was that transmission of interest rates to borrowers would now be very swift, since marginal rates of deposits would move up and down in line with RBI repo rates. This was done under the great Raghuram Rajan, who was the RBI governor at that time. But MCLR was also an internal benchmark, and the RBI gave banks various ways to calculate it. Once again, after giving the guidelines, nobody went back and checked whether the banks were doing it correctly or not, or whether they were padding it up, manipulating. No inspection. So MCLR also failed because it was another internal benchmark. Banks were left to do what they wanted to do, and so there was no transmission. Now, seeing all this in 2018, 2017-18, we started writing to the RBI saying that this is a wrong way of doing it, and the rates are not coming down for floating rate borrowers. We were speaking on behalf of consumers. We were not bothered about anybody else because we represent consumers. And people are still in base rate and BPLR and so on and so forth. And so it was quite a long petition. We went right up to the Supreme Court and said that this is unfair, this is opaque, this is discriminatory. Please ask RBI to do something. So RBI wasn't replying to us. They don't recognize us for all these issues. So the Supreme Court told the RBI, please reply to Moneylife Foundation's petition. RBI didn't reply. But what happened is on December 5th, suddenly, the governor was Urjit Patel at that time, the RBI suddenly issued a directive saying that the banks have to shift now to an external benchmark, because now all the internal benchmarks for 25 years have failed. So now you have to shift to external benchmark. But within a week or so after that, Urjit Patel resigned. A new governor came, Shaktikanta Das. And one of the first things he said, oh, that's not a policy. This was a policy announced by the governor. Banks were given a deadline, which is I think 1st May, to shift to the external benchmark. Suddenly under the new governor, within a matter of weeks and months, this was no policy decision. We are reviewing it. That's what the new governor said. Well, that only helped the banks. So banks continued to do what they wanted to do. Unfortunately, there's a lot of clamor everywhere. Rates should be cut, so RBI was cutting rates. But here was a situation where the RBI was cutting rates, banks were not cutting the rates commensurately, and the politicians were getting worked up. And all of the policy makers who support rate cuts suddenly found rate cuts was not enough. Rate cuts are not being transmitted. So, in fact, it's very interesting that while politicians and businessmen don't see eye to eye on anything during a downturn, the businessmen want the government to do something, the ministers want to do something else. One thing they agree on, definitely, is that interest rates should be cut. Now, one thing further they agreed on, that interest rates are being cut but not being transmitted. And so, they started asking around, what's going on? Why is interest rate transmission not happening? The reason was obviously very, very clear, and it's been clear for 25 years, which is we needed to introduce an external benchmark, right, which is transparent. And everybody could see, okay, rates are cut and this bank has not cut rates, or the other bank has, and so on and why. So it's all transparent and not opaque and non-discriminatory. Now, the previous finance ministers, I remember, have all the time talked about this. I remember Chidambaram or Pranab Mukherjee, whoever was the chief minister, if interest rates were being cut, they'd ask the banks, why aren't you cutting the rates in a commensurate fashion? But nothing really happened. There was no policy action and so on and so forth. This government is different. When it wants to do something, it wants to do something, and it just gets it done. So they just, my information is that RBI was just ordered, forget about examining this issue and so on and so forth, which Shaktikanta Das talked about in after he became the governor. Please ensure that we have an external benchmark, exactly what Urjit Patel had asked for and what Das had put it in the cold storage. Now, this move is, as I said, really good for consumers because there's no discrimination anymore. But the question is, of the benchmarks that we have, most popular benchmark is the repo rate. Okay, that is repurchase option, the repo rate of the RBI, which is the RBI rate. The question is repo rate the right external benchmark? Because home loans are long, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Repo rate is short term, and therefore there's going to be some issues regarding this. Banks will have to probably frequently change the rates. It's going to confuse the consumers, and also banks have been claiming that since the liability side is not floating, which is like the deposits are fixed and so on and so forth, the large parts of the deposit, we do not have the flexibility of transmission. So to protect themselves, banks have immediately started linking the savings account rates with the external benchmark too. So this will in turn confuse and I think drive away a lot of people, because post office rates and other deposit rates are not going to be floating. So many people, after they become aware the savings rates are going up and down, they probably will look for other places to put their money. Now, the third messy part of this whole thing is that all of this, the external benchmark, transmission, blah, blah, all this applies only to banks. It does not apply to finance companies. And there's a very large segment of borrowers who borrow money from the NBFCs. They don't come under this transmission business. So they anyway charge more than the banks. So there's going to be really two divergent rates. So the right course of action should have been done long ago, is to really think through all these challenges and come up with a much more solid external benchmark for it to be linked to the floating rates. But nobody was paying much attention to it. As I said, the ministry ranted about transmission after every rate cut, but didn't ask for a thoughtful solution. Banks were happy to manipulate the internal benchmarks and continue to fleece borrowers, and the RBI wasn't really bothered. So when the government really cracked down on poor transmission this time, RBI just quickly took the path of least resistance and they said, okay, external benchmark banks. Now, our banks and RBI will have to deal with all of the serious consequences that I talked about, but then for 25 years they have lived with this, and now they have brought this upon themselves. So they will have to deal with this mess, I guess. So that's all for this fortnight. Thanks for watching.